Good morning. Your lunch is going to be delayed a little bit, but hopefully you'll survive. Now, future of diver protection, it's perhaps a little bit misleading because in a way we're going to talk about past, current, and a little bit about the future. It's really all the same. We are the people who have to make sure that we protect the divers and as leaders. So first, the disclosures. Bottom line, I'm happy to take money from anybody to do research, but they don't buy the opinion. So the opinion is mine, but I'm happy to take people's money. That's easy. And so I spent about 20 years working at the chamber at the left. That's at Duke University in North Carolina in the US. And I was recruited to come up to Laval in Canada, and now it's a 6-year-old chamber. And the hardest thing about getting work done there is that it's so clean and pristine, and they want to keep it that way. It's much easier to work with a 55-year-old chamber. So before we get started, thanks very much to BSAC for inviting me to come. This is actually always fun to see this group, and the size this year is phenomenal. So a little bit about the world of diving. It's massive. I'm not going to read through this list, but you can probably find your area of interest in it. When we talk about what we have to do for the care and feeding of divers, we have to remember that there are a lot of different divers out there, a lot of different needs. And when you're serving as a leader in the community, you have to really remember that whatever you model to that community could be used or misused. So we have to be very careful about that. And so we've got all of these different applications from the recreational, the scientific, military, occupational, public safety. We've also got diving for science. We've got so many people who make their living exploring the underwater world to pursue their science, but then we've also got what I focus on a little bit more now, and that is the diving science. And this is great fun. To me, this is a lot better than working for a living, when you can actually look at these different applications and how they can help the diver. So we'll be talking about a few things. First, let's think about the things that could go wrong for divers. And before I show these, I want to remind you, I love to dive. Don't go away depressed. We have to remember there are risks, but the trick is to manage risks, not to walk away from them. But we have to think about our divers. First thing, we have to be concerned about their general health. Far before they get into the water, we have to make sure, or we, for ourselves or for our partners or for our clients, patients, whatever, we have to make sure that they're healthy enough to dive. Then we want to make sure that they have the physical fitness, the cardiac health, and the mental health to also pursue it. You heard a presentation on mental health. This is something that's growing in interest lately, but it's also very, very hard to evaluate. But this is certainly a concern that you have to maintain. Anytime anyone's in the water, we have to think about the worry about drowning and trauma. When you go down, we've got to worry, when you put someone in the water, you immediately put a strain on the heart. A lot of people don't fully appreciate that. Just immersing the body in water causes a shift of blood to the thorax, and that means more blood returns to the heart between beats. That means the heart stretches harder, and it reflexively contracts harder. So if you're someone who's if you're in a fragile cardiac state, and you immerse yourself in water, there's a huge physiological hit. And that's independent of diving. That's just immersing yourself in water. So we have to be aware that cardiac risk factors are a concern in the water and in diving. We worry about barotrauma, no big surprise there. The most frequent injury or problem reported by divers involves the ears. So that's certainly a problem. Alternate baric vertigo, term coined by the Russians, if you didn't know this. He got so dizzy he didn't know vertigo? No? Come on, work with me here a little bit. So, alternate baric vertigo, that extreme dizziness and disorientation. This is something that we actually do a terrible job teaching in classes. Most people don't learn about it in classes. And the first time you get vertigo, it can be quite disturbing. But once you understand what it is, it's actually really very benign. All you have to do is maintain your position for a few seconds until the pressure differential wanes and it goes away. So as long as you don't panic and bolt, you can solve this problem very easily. But we do typically a terrible job of teaching this to students. So that's a point to note. And then hypoxia. Not a problem if you've got fresh gas open circuit, but if you're a closed circuit rebreather diver, you can worry about hypoxia. Okay, we continue on in the dive. We get to depth, we might have to worry about narcosis. We've got thermal stress, contaminated breathing gas. We know that if you're breathing a 1% contamination at the surface, if you go to 4 atmospheres pressure, you're breathing 4 times the molecules in each breath. So you are really poisoning yourself much quicker underwater than you would be at the surface. That's a concern. Oxygen toxicity. Oxygen toxicity is a problem that I think we're seeing now in that people are being really stubborn. There's some pretty good evidence that makes us want to be a little bit more conservative on how high a PO2 we expose ourselves to. But there are a lot of people who want to fall into the trap of, oh, I've been doing this forever, I've never had a problem, it's perfectly fine. We learn, and when we learn, we should be changing. I'm willing to bet most people who drove here today used their seatbelts. 30 years ago, you might not have. You know, we evolve. We have to evolve. To be closed-minded just because you've done something in the past doesn't make sense. We really do need to reevaluate things and change based on the available information. So, next thing we have, immersion pulmonary edema. This is another one of those issues that people don't know enough about. And I'll give credit, in Britain right now, there's a concerted effort to develop material that can go out to educate divers, leaders, EMS personnel, and medical personnel. And so right now there's a concerted effort to get the word out, because immersion pulmonary edema is probably one of the more under-recognized problems we see in diving. And if it's a mild case, it's not so bad. It can resolve very nicely on its own. But if it's a severe case, it can create a life threat. And so we do have to be aware of immersion pulmonary edema. We're not done. Man, the dive continues. On the way up, there's more thermal stress. It never ends. Okay, then we still have alternobaric vertigo. Remember, it can go up or down. And the reason this is important to note, if you read some people's information, alternobaric vertigo, they say, okay, to solve the problem, you should go down to reverse the pressure. But it depends. The problem can occur when you're going down or going up. So if you arbitrarily pick a direction to go in, you might be making the situation worse. So the only way to treat alternobaric vertigo is to stay in one place. Don't change at all until it goes away. So we have to be thoughtful in how we develop protocols, and sometimes people miss out on that. Reverse blocks, if you manage to push your way through with a little bit of congestion to get down, no guarantee you'll get back up safely, which is why it's a great reason not to dive in that condition. And then arterial gas embolism, decompression sickness, they can occur. It used to be that people would say if symptoms occurred within 10 minutes of surfacing, that was AGE. And if there were more than 10 minutes from surfacing, it was DCS. We can't say that anymore. With technical diving, it's possible to miss so much of a decompression obligation that you will develop your symptoms on the way up. And so those simple rules that once made sense don't make as much sense now. So we have to think about the complicated picture that we face. But still, if you're diving in a benign manner, it may be. If symptoms occur shortly after surfacing, maybe it is AGE. If it's delayed, maybe it is DCS. But be careful not to put too hard a rule in place in what is an incredibly dynamic activity right now, this diving thing that we do. And then finally, the last two I want to point out are the long-term, a couple of long-term effects. And this would be dysbaric osteonecrosis and those white matter lesions that Peter Wilmhurst here in the UK was really trying to get people to be aware of. These long-term concerns are why I encourage very conservative decompression. You can come up from a dive and feel pretty good, but you may have a subclinical insult that over time will come back to bite you. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that and to make each dive both what it needs to be, but also as conservative as possible so you don't have any downstream effects. And so that is really important to me. I've been accused of being too conservative, of forcing people to stay in the water too long, or encouraging them to stay in the water too long. I just don't accept that at all. I'd rather be in the water than not. It's not a bad thing to be in the water, but to get bent or injured and spend time in a chamber, to have a long-term problem, that to me is the penalty. So extra time to me is just inexpensive insurance. Okay, so these are all the things we worry about. If you still want to dive, stay here. Diving is fun, it's good, it's all about managing risk. So what have we done in the past? You can start history wherever you want. I'm going to start in 1940 with Chris Lambertson, who is considered the father of special forces, and he developed the LaRue, the Lambertson Amphibious Respirator Unit. And this was a closed-circuit rebreather. We have the Cousteau-Gagnon demand regulator. It wasn't the first, but it was the one that really caught the world and got people interested in diving. Then we've got single hose regulator and the J valve. These came out in 1951. The reason this is important to note, there are a lot of people here who've probably been diving for a long time, and some who say, what the hell is a J valve? And we do really have to remember that we have a broad community we have to service. For those who don't remember the J valve, it was a little knob. When you turned it up, it pushed a spring in place. Contrary to what some people thought, it didn't give you an extra 500 psi of gas. What it did is it cut off you getting to the last 300 to 500 psi of gas until you turn the knob down to pull the spring out. So basically, J valves were standard for a long time. It was a good safety feature. Another good safety feature, BSAC formed as the first certifying agency in 1953. And so you beat North America by about 6 years. Now we formed in 1959. CMAS was a little bit before that, I think maybe 1956. The SOS dive computer. This was the first serious attempt to try to make a computer that could control your physiological risk. This was nicknamed the Bend-O-Matic. So it might give you an idea that maybe it wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect. It was a good plan, but and some people swear by them. But here's an important concept too, to me. If you are not diving close to a limit, the fact that that limit exists means nothing in terms of your evaluation process. Let me make sure I say that again. You may have a limit. You say, I'm going to be able to dive to a PO2 of 1.6 atmospheres. But if you always dive at 1.3, you don't know anything about the safety of that limit. So the people say, oh, we've had this limit in place for years. It's safe. How the hell do you know? You don't dive there. It's the same thing with SOS. The people who thought this worked really well, it's probably because they stayed away from the limits. Those who pushed it made the name. Okay. Submersible pressure gauge. I don't know what year this came out, so I'm not going out on a limb here, but somewhere in there we did finally decide that maybe we shouldn't just rely on that J valve. We should use a pressure gauge. The Fenzi came out as a life jacket in 1961. In 1968, it was advertised as a buoyancy compensator. And so that was really when we started to make life easier. Didn't have to carry rocks anymore and leave them somewhere on the way down and hopefully find them on the way back up. Now you could put on a little more weight and wear a BCD. The auto-inflate came in 1971, and along with the stabilizing jacket. So Scuba Pro made the first stabilizing jacket. And this was definitely the zone of comfort. Now, you could argue with some of these dates. This is a mixture of the date something was created versus the date it became popularized. In this case, the auto-inflate actually picked up pretty quickly. The stab jacket took a while before it got popular. But these dates are just to give you an idea of what we've seen in the development over time. Octopus regulator was first actually credited to some work done at UNEXO when they were supporting some of Jacques Mayall's deep dives in 1965. But it probably hit the mainstream somewhere in the early 70s. Modern dive computers, we could start with a DecoBrain in 1983 and go from there. Recreational nitrox training, the voodoo gas, for those who remember that debate. Now we see nitrox. If I ever talk to someone they've had decompression sickness or they're worried about pushing the limits, a very simple solution is to use use nitrox on air tables. And so you build in conservatism. Nitrox has good benefits as long as you're not going too deep. Auto dump valve. This is one that came in, again, I'm not sure exactly what year, but somewhere in the 80s, everybody started to go to them. And this was really nice. You had a much easier time controlling your ascent. One of the biggest operational safety measures that I think came in place was the safety stop. And this was first put, as far as I know, it was first put in a PADI manual in about 1984. But in 1988, they developed something called the SAFE program, Safe Ascent from Every Dive. And the idea was they went all out to promote everybody to do safety stops. And that extra shallow stop time is probably the best protection you can have against decompression stress. And I'll tell you this, if 3 minutes is good, 5 minutes is better. If 5 minutes is good, you know where we're going here. Extra shallow stop time really is your friend in terms of decompression safety. Tech diving was coined not that long ago, 1990. Inspiration CCR, another UK product, came out in 1997. So the first what we'd call a mass-marketed CCR that really took the rebreather world. It really had the market share. And technical diving computers, somewhere after 2000, 2001, we have what we could consider the modern tech diving computer, able to handle multiple gases and enabling you to go almost anywhere you possibly shouldn't be. And the last example on this sheet, not that it's the last one in development, but hell, I ran out of room. That's it. The temp stick. And so let's just use the temp stick as an example. This is a good example of how the manufacturers have tried to address a problem with what is available. And the problem is we don't measure CO2 well in a closed circuit rebreather loop. We can't measure it well, so what do? Well, a temp stick was created where you have a series of thermistors that measure temperature in a scrubber bed, and they measure the heat. And that heat shows that the scrubber is reacting. That means it's reacting with CO2. And so by measuring the temperature profile, you could determine if it was still active. When it got cold, it means the scrubber's no longer working, you better stop. And so this is interesting. It addressed CO2 problems without ever measuring CO2. So this is an important tool that exemplified what could be done at the time. Well, now, in 2013, I believe Martin Parker came out with their CO2 sensor, and so it's now available on the AP platform. It's not perfect. And the problem is, CO2 looks a lot like water vapor. And in a closed-circuit rebreather, what's one thing you have a lot of? Water vapor. It's a closed-circuit loop that you're breathing on. And so these systems are not yet perfect. Eventually, we may go to a solid state, but what I'm trying to show you on this is the idea that we have an evolving bar where we try to get a little bit better information, but we also have to remember what we have is rarely perfect. And what gets a lot of divers in trouble is they put too much faith in their tools. And that's what we have to avoid. We also have to realize that we're probably past the point that we're going to see massive innovations on a major scale. I don't know how many of you saw the Kickstarter campaign for the Triton breathing system. This was straight out of James Bond Goldfinger, where it had the two bars out here, and you put it in your mouth, and it was saying it was extracting oxygen from the seawater. They brought in almost $1 million of funding just before the last minute. It was canceled because there were complaints about the lack of legitimacy of this thing. But people wanted to believe it, and so they were willing to put their money down. You have to be a little bit more critical in your thinking. This is crazy how we accept some of the things we're told when really they don't make a lot of sense. So we're in an incremental age. We're not going to see massive changes. We're not going to see a pump the size of my finger that can pump 30 liters of seawater per minute. We're just not going to see it. Okay, so what are the critical concepts? The commercial market, the competitive market, will provide what the user wants to buy. If you say, I want this, somebody is going to make it and sell it to you. But you have to remember, just because a product is available doesn't mean you need it or should get it. There's a big difference between what is available and what you should get. So you really have to be critical in how you evaluate these things. And this next line is most important because earlier on somebody said there's a lot of information on the internet. Yes, there is. But guess what? It's not all true. So internet does not equal truth. There's just not a relationship there. So you have to be critical. The best protection a diver has is still between the ears. And you have to think. You can't believe the hype. So how do we protect divers? Well, first, we have to make sure we tie together the medicine, the physiology, and the engineering. We have to make sure that any innovations make sense. They have to make sense. Then we have to look at training and practice. Sometimes we train for something, but practice ends up being very different. That is a problem. It really bothers me sometimes, and this was something we saw in commercial fatalities for a while. It seemed that every fatality had a conclusion. The diver did not follow the rules, therefore he died. The diver did not follow the rules. The diver did not follow the rules. Nobody seemed to ask the question of, why the hell weren't these divers following the rules? Maybe there was a little bit of a problem with the rule. And so we have to be thoughtful. We have to look at training. We have to look at practice. We have to make sure we have no disconnects. That's on us. So we have to be vigilant, and we have to make sure we get a valid appraisal of facts. There's a problem in people wanting to be rosy in their analyses. And let's go back to the internet. How often on Facebook do you see people really admitting to their worst failures? Not as often as they talk about their best or fantasy successes. So we have to remember that if you're living off the internet, you may be getting false information. So we need honest reporting to make sure that the information we have on a case or on a piece of equipment or on a practice is really well thought out. And then we have to evolve. When we learn something, we can't be closed-minded to it. We have to really say, does this make sense? Have I thought about it? Am I sure? Do I want to implement it? We have to be willing to change to adopt new information. So how do we assess innovations? Well, it's easy. Number one, you think about the benefits. This part's easy. Everybody thinks they have the perfect benefit out of their innovation. But you have to realize there are two arms to that. You've got the intended benefit and you've got the actual benefit. And this is important. How many people have heard about, a lot of people got excited about argon, using it to fill the dry suit because theoretically it's got really good insulation value. But interestingly enough, the tests that were done showed that there was no difference on skin temperature, core temperature, or perceived comfort. And some people say, well, how can that be? The physics are true. Well, there's one aspect of physics people forgot. When you're in a dry suit and you go underwater, where does the gas pocket go in the dry suit? It goes up to the top. It's not bathing your body uniformly in this layer of argon. And so physics does sometimes fight against physics. And so we have to remember to compare the intended benefit to the actual benefit. For those of you who want to use argon, if you get brownie points for every piece of equipment you have, get an argon system. It's good for you. If you're concerned about, high quality insulation and is it worth the wait, probably not. Okay, we have to think about costs and hazards. Well, some generic ones, in most cases, when you add a piece of equipment, you do have added complexity. You have to worry about reliability. You have an extra failure point. You have to think about the training requirements. So adding things is not something that should be done lightly. You have to have a really sound rationale for it. And then we also have to think about unintended consequences. And this is the one that can bite us a lot. And I'm going to give you 5 examples coming up of things that there's some unintended consequences in a lot of cases. And these can be positive, that would be great, but more often than that, they're negative. And if nothing else, one of the most common negative consequences is skill erosion. When you give someone a dive computer, how often do they study their tables? Not at all. Now, do they have to? No. But they really should understand the concepts that that computer is based on. But we tend, once we give someone a piece of technology, we tend to see a loss of the earlier skills. And at times, the experience we get in mastering and maintaining those earlier skills can keep us out of trouble. So we have to be aware that if nothing else, skill erosion is a problem. So let's talk about one of my favorites, deep stops. The intended benefit was really good. I don't know how many people here still love deep stops, but the intended benefit was good. If we stop deeper than normal, we will control bubble formation. That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. So the actual effect, you did reduce bubble formation during the initial ascent. Absolutely true. But here's the downside. You probably wouldn't have had bubbles there anyway. Because those deep stops are so deep, you didn't have enough pressure reduction that you were going to get bubbles. But there is a cost. And that is, by staying there during that deep stop period, you are prolonging the time at which unsaturated slow or intermediate tissues are still taking on more inert gas. And so you are doing something to avoid a problem that probably wasn't real, and you're creating another problem when you do that. So the negative consequence of the deep stops is it actually increased the amount of time you needed subsequent to that to off-gas enough to be safe. So deep stops were a great concept. They sounded good, but the problem we had in the community is people jumped on the bandwagon too quickly. Rather than thinking it through and evaluating it carefully, there was a huge rush to action. And now it's taking a lot of years to unspool that rush to action. So summary evaluation, it was a rushed adoption, and they really are not productive. So, the alternate, more shallow stop time. Remember that cheap insurance thing I talked about earlier? If you want to make yourself as safe as possible, more extra shallow stop time is really your best friend. Okay, what about distributed weighting? Another one of my pet peeves. The idea is people complain about wearing that heavy weight belt around their middle. So they said, gee, why don't I put some in a steel tank? I'll put some on the steel tank. I'll put some in the pockets of my BC. Basically, I'll get rid of all of it. And it really makes your back, it feels pretty good. So actual effect is roughly as intended. Yeah, you don't have the back pain, you don't complain as much, you don't have bruises on your hips. That's all good. But there's a cost, and that is you lose the ditchability. Now, if you're a technical diver and there's no way in the world you want to hit the surface prematurely, maybe it makes sense to not have any ditchable weight. But for a lot of people, particularly recreational dive range, I would posit that you are more likely to stay alive in all circumstances if you're able to get to the surface than if you're stuck on the bottom. I don't know. I don't know too many people who breathe water, so I just go with that. So we lose the ditchability, and it's not just a problem of losing the ditchability today. The unintended consequences is we lose the mindfulness of ditchability. And I see a lot of divers now who are going out of their way to get the heaviest, most negatively buoyant tanks they can, and they're taking every bit of weight and they're putting it in a pocket that they cannot possibly ditch, because they're just not even thinking about the benefits of being able to ditch. And this is, to me, a real hazard where we have given someone a new tool that the manufacturers are happy to give you any pocket, anywhere, anytime, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. So summary evaluation, to me, you have to employ this with caution. Diver capability should also be tested. And the way I describe this, if you have somebody who wants to go without ditchable weight, I say put them in the water, exhaust their BC, their dry suit, whatever they have, and ask them to kick and hold their head above water. If they can do it easily, no problem. If they can't do it easily, maybe they should be reassessing how they distribute their weight, because this can become a real life threat. And back to the lower back pain problem, underwater, it's really quite easy. If you just curl up and you hold yourself like this for about 30 seconds, it's amazing. The damn back pain goes away. You know, there are alternates to making weight not ditchable. And I believe there's a short distance between ha-ha and aha, so the whole point is make you laugh a little bit, you stay engaged. I don't want to make light of any of these issues. It is frustrating that we're just doing a review of 32 years of diving fatalities in Quebec, and we see 2 a year. So we have 61 fatalities. It's too many. And in a third of the cases, the weight belt has not been removed. And that's really frustrating because in those cases, in most of them, the weight belt could be removed. We have a problem at the best of times that people don't really think about that ballast weight as a good way to get the hell out of that dangerous place. And we have to do better making sure that people stay mindful. Okay, innovation, technical diving computers. And I'm being fair here, so I've got a couple different types of dive computer on the screen. These are, the intended benefit is clear. They facilitate diver monitoring and they ease dive planning, and they are great. This is truly enabling technology. What used to be very complicated to do, now you just say, hey, no problem, the box takes care of it. It's good. So the actual effect, it greatly expands your flexibility. You can go places, do things very easily. But there is a cost, and the cost is that you codify practice with limited data input. And let me make sure this makes sense. That dive computer is a dumb box. It does not know your reality. But it's really good at showing you a number. And we as human beings, for whatever reason, put a tremendous amount of faith in a number on a screen. And if the number on the screen says it's good, you say, it must be good. We have a lot of people who come into the chamber with symptoms and say, but I can't be bent, my computer was okay. Say, don't worry, it's okay, your computer will be fine. We have never treated a dive computer for decompression sickness. Doesn't happen. Divers, on the other hand, they do get treated occasionally. So these computers are really useful tools. And please, again, I'm going to say, I am not against dive computers. I am a big fan of the technology. But I'm also a big fan of not believing it too much. It doesn't know truth. And here's the truth. If you look at knowledge as a function of depth, virtually all of our knowledge about decompression physiology comes from a very shallow range where data was collected. But those decompression algorithms are all generated largely in a linear manner to allow people to get way down here, far beyond where we have data to represent them. So basically, every technical diver is a natural experiment. And every technical dive is a natural experiment. The computer may say it's okay, but that's based on a mathematical model, and I promise you, math does not equal physiology. I'm not a fan of math. I like physiology, and that right there, they're different things. So we have to remember that those dive computers are not perfect. So the unintended consequences, they have both positive and negative. Positive, they're great for record keeping. When we have accidents now, we have so much more information because of those downloadable dive computers. When we have people who have problems, they say, hey, why am I having this issue? We can just say, send us your logs. And we can do a forensic review and very quickly get really good insights. So there are huge positive gains, unintended consequences, but also negative. And the negative is that they allow divers to go beyond their truly competent range with virtually not a thought. And that's a problem. So summary evaluation. These are incredibly useful tools, but they are far less useful than your brains, if you use your brains. And that is important. And that's not supposed to be a joke. People say, well, how do I adapt on a given dive? Think about what the hell you've done. If you've been working harder, change something. If you're cold or hot, change something. You know what you're doing. You have to use your brains. The box is a guide. I like to say it gives you a first-order approximation of risk. That's all it does. It gets you in the ballpark. It's up to you to go further. Okay, so smart implementation. Be very mindful about what the box doesn't know. And the last time I presented at BSAC, I talked about decompression safety. And there are four main elements, classifications that I'd put into this. Number one is the dive profile. This is the elephant in the room. This is the single most important factor. And the good news is computers track that beautifully. So this information we have. However, dive computers don't track your physical activity. And when and how much you're working has a huge impact on decompression safety. Similarly, thermal status. It doesn't track it. And now some people at this point say, oh no, but mine does. Mine knows the temperature. Oh, there are kids here, I can't swear. Oh, okay. The computer knows the water temperature. It doesn't know your thermal status because you could be naked or you could be in a dry suit with undergarments. And so the computer doesn't know anything about your thermal state. So the idea, there is not a computer out there that in a meaningful way predicts the impact of thermal state on decompression algorithm. Not one. I challenge anybody to try to come up with a computer that does it in a meaningful way. And I'll tell you why I'm confident in that. Number one, we don't have the data, and we need the data first, and then we need to figure out how to plug it into the algorithm. We are years behind where we need to be to implement this data. But it is a goal. This is what we're going for. And then finally, fourth category, predisposition factors. All those things that make you unique also make your risk pattern unique. The dive computer doesn't know most of these things. So if you put too much faith in the number on that computer, you are at risk. And this is why I believe in putting conservative limits on exposures. I'd rather spend an extra bit of time putting in a decompression buffer than being surprised downstream. That to me is just smart practice. Okay, so one more. There are actually two more, but active heating garments. The intended benefit, very clear. Improve the comfort, extend your dive time. Everybody loves this concept. I can be comfortable, I can be happy. Why wouldn't I do this? Well, the actual effect is about what it's supposed to be. It allows you to stay more comfortable and to stay down longer. But there's a downside, there's a cost. The hazard and cost, number one, you have power requirements you need to pay attention to, and you have a risk of failure. And when you get the failure, this is when the picture gets a lot more complicated. And the unintended consequences, the negative side, is that those bad things that happen, like to power systems, are going to complicate your decompression status, and in almost all cases, they're making it worse. And I'll give you the best example here. There was a study done by the Navy Experimental Diving Unit in the US, and they used a wet pot, and they manipulated a dive into 2 phases, the descent and bottom phase, the ascent, and a really long decompression phase. And they manipulated water temperature. They either kept it warm, which you can see is 36 degrees C, or, and these people are in Florida, so they're Floridian wimps. So they called 27 degrees cold. Yeah, I know. So we can agree as an enlightened nation that this is cool. It is cool. Your mean skin temperature is about 32 degrees. So if you're in 27 degree water, you're actually chilling at a substantial rate because water is a huge heat sink. But it's not cold, it's cool. But so here is the important thing. When you manipulate, I hope this makes sense to you. If you go down warm to your deepest part of the dive, you have so much circulation, you're taking on much more inert gas. And then if you were cold on the way up, you're vasoconstricted, you're not eliminating that gas. That would be your worst case scenario. That would be warm-cold. On the flip side, if you went down thermoneutral or cool, you'd be vasoconstricted on the way down, you wouldn't take up as much inert gas. And if you could warm yourself on the way up, you'd vasodilate and you'd flush out more inert gas. Conceptually, nobody ever has a problem with that. But what people don't realize is the magnitude of this effect. If you go down warm and come up cold, they had a 30-minute bottom time at 37 minutes, and they bent 22% of their subjects. That's a big number. But here's the part that's even more interesting. What if we don't make them warm on the way down, we make them cool, and we bring them up warm? They were able to extend the bottom time to 70 minutes. They more than doubled the bottom time and only bent 1.3% of the subjects. For those of you who think your computer knows all of your information, this should convince you how little it knows. This is a massive impact on your decompression status that the computer is completely ignorant of. So, this is why you can't trust the box. So, summary evaluation of heated garments. I think that the marketing has been terrible. I've talked to several of the manufacturers, and as a rule, they don't seem to want to talk about the fact that this product could alter your decompression status. And I think that's very unreasonable. I think that's not appropriate. So we, the consumer, and you, the leader, have to make sure that people understand it's not just about comfort. There are true physiological implications of using these garments. And I'm not saying you shouldn't use them. But what I am saying, if you're going to use them, you have to employ extreme thoughtfulness. And if you can do that, it can be a useful tool. If you can't, then you're at risk. And for me, you really want to be fully informed so you can manage the risks. You have the control. Okay, last example. Last example is innovation technical freediving. And a little bit of history on this. The idea of this is, hey, we can use oxygen breathing between dives to recover and to boost our stores so we can breathe longer. And, we can take our final inspiration at depth. The reason for the inspiration at depth, I'll back up on this one. If you think about it, for years it was thought that the limit on free diving would be when the lung volume was compressed below residual. The thought was, when you compress it below residual, bad things would happen. You'd get a little blood coming into the alveoli, you'd get a little fluid congestion, wouldn't be good. Now, that's been blown away. People have gone far below that residual volume, but still, respiratory symptoms are one of the chief problems for deep free divers. And so the idea was, well, if we took a breath underwater, we would be starting from a bigger volume. We could go a lot deeper before it compressed to the point that it caused trouble. That's all true. So the intended benefit, improve performance and recovery and reduce the pulmonary stress. That's all true. Because you do see these acute respiratory symptoms that occur after deep dives, particularly repeated deep dives. And there was a study done in Europe by Cialoni et al., and they asked people who were free divers, what was your personal maximum depth, And have you ever had acute respiratory symptoms? And that would be everything from coughing up a little blood to cough to retrosternal pain, things that were frankly involving a little bit of pulmonary compromise. And what they found is up to 80% of the people who had a history of diving deeply said they had a history of these acute symptoms. So clearly this is a problem, and it would be great to avoid it. And it is true that if you breathe a full breath of gas under pressure and then dive deeper, there will be less squeeze. But what happens if you forget to exhale on the way up? Then you have a really bad day. So the actual effect is as intended, but there's a cost and hazard. And if you're breathing oxygen, you have an increased risk of oxygen seizure. That's a problem. And then you also have a real problem of pulmonary overpressure. And people say, oh, we'll remember, no problem. We will take our final breath at 15 feet, and when we come back up at 20 feet, 15, we'll exhale everything. What if you forget? What if something goes wrong and you're helping somebody because there's a problem? What if you're impaired through hypoxia? What if any number of things? Breathing gas under pressure and coming up is not a great idea. We know from dog studies primarily that you can embolize by taking a full breath in compressed air from as shallow as 5 feet of seawater and then coming up to the surface. To intentionally plan to breathe a full breath of gas deeper, then go down and come up in a possibly compromised state, this is just not rational. And let me tell you just quickly how this came to be. This largely came out of the filming of Avatar 2. They were doing a lot of filming in a 15-foot pool, and they wanted to be able to have the stars and the support workers stay underwater a little bit longer so they just didn't have to come up as frequently. It made sense. And there was an awful lot of hand-wringing. Is this safe? Should we do it? Is it okay? And absolutely, only 15 feet, maximum 15 feet, nothing deeper. And it was okay at 15 feet. But the problem with human nature is mission creep. Once we open the door, that door is open. And so it went from that little bit of we'll have our safety divers do it and we'll have our stars do it to now technical free diving is something we're going to market to the world. And this is something that I'm going to put my hand up right now and say this is another deep stops problem that I think this could be done safely. It could be done safely. But we know that when you give a tool to someone, while some people do it safely, some people take it a little bit too far. I will put my hand up and say, I think this is not a good idea. So I think that we're pushing the limits, and because of human nature, we're going to have problems. And if you are putting yourself into a position where you have to make decisions when you might be impaired, I see bad things happening with this. So, okay, summary evaluation. I think it's got a high risk if it's normalized. In other words, if it's turned loose to the masses. People who are really cautious with it could do fine. It's when you turn it loose to the masses. And smart implementation for me is, I don't think it's feasible. I think it's not. I think this is not something that should be marketed openly. Okay, so what's the future of diver protection? Number one, engineering is still going to try to engineer out problems. So we are going to get those incremental changes where we see people getting rid of the equipment problems. And that's good. We have a lot of good manufacturers we have to support because they're doing their best to make products that help us. We have to be careful not to ask for things that we want that maybe we shouldn't have. And be careful what you wish for. We have to critically evaluate all of the equipment and all the practices to make sure that we really are making smart decisions. Sometimes we need somebody else to do those for us, but we have to push as a community to make sure that the questions are asked. So we need research quality evaluations. We need objective evaluations of all data and claims. And then we need cautious implementation. You shouldn't go too far into drinking the Kool-Aid until you're sure that this is a good idea. We have a problem with excessive exuberance. When we have incidents, we have to report them. And this is fatal, non-fatal, and near misses. We have a problem with capturing all the cases that are out there. And there are a lot of reasons. Some people don't want to report because they don't want to look like an idiot. Some people are afraid of liability. They're afraid of losing their ability to do something. There are a lot of reasons people are afraid. We have to continue to focus on decriminalizing this knowledge so people are willing to share information, and then we don't use it to point fingers at them. We use it to help educate so the next person doesn't have the problem. We work very hard in accident analysis to not just blame the victim and to actually use it to help people learn from it. We have to make sure everybody who has a near miss or a serious problem reports it so we can have benefit across the community. It doesn't help you to hide it, because those people who are looking at you as a role model, if they think you never screw up and you do those things, they'll do exactly what you do, and you've kept your mouth shut about the last injury you had. This is not good. We need to be open and communicate. We need better diver monitoring. The more we can monitor our divers, and I'm not saying Big Brother monitor, I'm saying the more information we can get and feed back to the diver and feed back to understand situations, the better we will be able to understand the risks. And increasing real-time feedback to divers is very useful. And I'll use the example here, breathing gas density. Gavin Anthony is in here somewhere, I think. Gavin, are you out there? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So Gavin's here, Simon Mitchell is here. They put together this paper based on some years of research that Gavin did looking at gas density and the effort of breathing, and they were able to show where we probably want to limit our gas density. We are at a point right now where we can and should be putting gas density measurements in a lot of these dive computers so the diver can see in real time what their gas density is so they can get a warning when it's getting too high. We can do that. And that is coming. I'm willing to bet that you will see that available within the next 2 years, probably 1 year would be my bet. And we also need to promote cultural practice. A lot of what happens to divers is based on what they choose to do. I was a diving officer at a university for a lot of years, and I fully understood that when I was with the divers, they would dive one way, but when I was gone, they would do whatever the hell they would do. You have to accept that as a reality, and you have to educate divers to understand and make smart decisions. They will make smart decisions if they understand, a lot of them will make smart decisions if they understand the true risks. But we have to make sure we educate them. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to point out here, I said promotion of best practice with evidence outcome. How do we get better evidence? Well, here's my diver of the future. Here's a technical diver, and I'm going to use this as an example because the equipment a technical diver uses gives us a better platform to collect high-quality data. And that doesn't mean that this is of no value to open circuit divers. It means that what we learn from these divers, we can translate across the spectrum. But here's some of the things we can get. Through that mouthpiece, we should be able to figure out the O2 pressures on the expired gas. We should get the O2, the carbon dioxide pressures. We should know the end-tidal CO2, end-tidal O2. We should be able to get the pressures and the temperatures, information that's useful. On the inspiration side, if we get the inspired values on both of those, we can compute metabolic effort. RER, respiratory exchange ratio, is an effort, a measure of your metabolic effort that's tied to workload. So we can get RER, we can get gas density computations easily, and here's the neat thing about gas density. If we compute it right now on a computer uses open circuit, we're using the gases that you say are in your tank. If we were to use it in this mouthpiece, we would know what the CO2 was. We could actually compute the real gas density, which includes the CO2. And the density of CO2 is 50% more than that of air. And so that CO2 has a pretty big factor. We could get a more accurate measure in this kind of system. We know that immersion pulmonary edema is an under-recognized problem in diving. Wouldn't it be cool if you could put your mouthpiece in before a dive and after a dive and do a quick test to check your spirometric values and to determine your lung status? And I'll tell you the biggest reason this is important now, vaping. We have a whole problem with vaping that could really destroy a lot of lungs and divers. The idea of being able to evaluate someone pre and post dive could be really, really useful. So spirometric tests in that mouthpiece are possible. And for those of you who don't, maximum voluntary ventilation, this is a 15-second test. You breathe in and out gas as fast as you can, and it gives you a pretty good idea of your capability at that point. We could do that in real time. We could measure heart rate and ECG. We could measure the frequency of ventilation, eventually the volume that's being breathed. And we could also, over the chest, start to look for intravascular bubbles. We could do all of that in the near future. And now this is starting to look like pie in the sky. Let me tell you that this kind of physiological monitoring is heavily pushed by militaries. And we've got a project right now with the Canadian military. U.S. military is doing an awful lot with warfighter protection. The astronaut population is heavily monitored, and they want to do more monitoring. So there's a lot of push outside of diving for this kind of capability. Bringing it to the diving world is to our benefit. We could measure blood pressure. We could measure skin temperature. We could look for extravascular bubbles. You can use optical sensors and look at bubbles in the top half centimeter of skin. You can't see a lot, but that would give you some indication of stress. Putting these all together, we have a lot of powerful measures. We could look at joint angle, joint velocity. We could look at kick rate and kick depth. Ultimately, those things might even give us a measure of the person's buoyant state. You could determine the angle they were at, the amount of force they were using. You could determine whether they were positive or negatively buoyant. So there's a lot of information we could get from these divers. And then a couple more. If we put in the head an inclinometer, we could determine the person's trim. And there are a couple of reasons this would be good. As a training platform, at the end of the dive or in real time, you could see an evidence of your trim, and you could improve your trim to get better input. Also, in the case of accidents, we could determine if the person maintained a position or if they went to a suddenly upright position, which is often associated with panic. And so this inclinometer is really good both for educational feedback and potentially for forensic evaluation. GPS system, there's still a problem with the water, but eventually we'll be able to track the position of divers, and it could be very helpful. And then finally, one of my favorites, we now have these head-up displays. With AP platform, you have a HUS, you have NERDS, you have all kinds of different platforms. You can look and get all the information on the screen. Well, why not have it looking back at you and be measuring your pupil diameter, look for nystagmus, look for signs of hypoxia, hyperoxia, seizure, any number of things. We have the potential within my lifetime to measure a lot of these things. And integrating this, we could get a truly powerful picture of the state of the diver. And this is probably where we're going. It's not going to happen overnight. Right now, we're looking at the least expensive and most practical options to employ today that have some benefit. There has to be a market benefit to the manufacturers to justify the cost. But over time, we're going to see more and more of this sort of technology implemented, and that will give us more information to help us further educate and inform the divers to keep what's between their ears as ready to go to manage risk. And with that, thank you very much.